Today's daf. Today's daf is Chaf Gimel. So we're up to the top line on daf Chaf Gimel. The Yontif Chamisha, on a Yontif we call it 5 Kruim. The Yom Kippur Shisha 6, and Shabbos is 7. And you cannot have less than that. Those are the minimum, but the Mishnah says explicitly you're allowed to add. There are Hosofos. Masnis and Mani, lo K'Rabbi Yishmael, lo K'Rabbi Akiva. It seems that from the record in the Brisa of the Machlokas between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, none of those two shitas seem to be reconcilable with our Mishnah. Because as we'll see, Rabbi Yishmael will not allow for Hosofos, and Rabbi Akiva switches it entirely around. The Sanya, the Yontif Chamisha is so far like our Mishnah. Yontif gets 5 aliyahs, Yom Kippur 6, Shabbos 7, Ein Poksemen, but Ein Motzifin Aleim Tivir Rabbi Yishmael. Which means it's exactly that number, 5, 6, and 7. You can't add. And our Mishnah allows you to add. So our Mishnah can't be Rabbi Yishmael. But what about Rabbi Akiva? Well, that's even worse. Because Rabbi Akiva Omer b'Yom Tov Chamisha, so far so good, 5 Kruim on Yom Tov. But now look at this. Yom Kippur Shiva, we jump in a jacket up to 7 on Yom Kippur. Now Yom Kippur has more than Shabbos, because Shabbos only has 6. And in the note here, he quotes the Rosh Yosef, right? If I'm not mistaken, that's Pri Megadim, who takes a shot at trying to understand Rabbi Akiva. On Shabbos, we have a mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos. And therefore, we don't want to extend the Kriya and the amount of Korim beyond that of Yom. So if Yom is 5, Shabbos will jack it up to 6. And that gives us plenty of time to add for Simchas Yom. However, in the case of Yom Kippurim, since there's no Achil and Jasiyah, so there's no formal mitzvah of Oneg, therefore we can enhance our stay in the Beis HaKnesset, expand Kriyas HaTorah, and jack up the number of Kruim to 7. Mani. So who is our Mishnah reflecting? Rabbi Yishmael. They can't be Rabbi Yishmael. Kash Tosefes. Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yishmael does not allow for Tosefes, whereas our Mishnah does. The Rabbi Akiva, if you try to reflect that our Mishnah is the Shita of Rabbi Akiva, Kasha Shisha V'Shiva, he switches around Shabbos and Yom Kippurim. Our Mishnah Shabbos as 7. Rabbi Akiva holds that Yom Kippurim is 7 and Shabbos is only 6. Our Mishnah has Yom Kippurim as 6, whereas Rabbi Akiva has Yom Kippurim as 7. Amar Rava, Tana Debei Rishmol. We're going to see another brisa also quoting Rabbi Yishmael, but in a different record. The Tana Debei Rabbi Yishmael, in that base measure of Rabbi Yishmael, they taught that beyond the Chamisha, beyond Kippur Chicha, but Shabbat Shiva, vein Palchas Ameim, Amal Mosifin Aleim. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael, which is word for word our Mishnah. So the Gemara asks Bakasha Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yishmael. Now we have a steer in Rabbi Yishmael. The Gemara answers straight Tanoi, I leave Rabbi Yishmael. So there are two versions amongst the Tanoim, exactly what Rabbi Yishmael holds. Is there a leniency to allow for Hosafa or not? And the assumption here is that when you add numbers, not only do you lose the special number, but in addition, you extend the amount of tefillah and the time in the Beis HaKnesset, which we might not be so excited about doing in the case of Yom Tov and Shabbos, where there's a mitzvah of Oneg and Simcha. And therefore, we would like to cut out Hosafos. Many people today many shuls try to cut down on Hosafos. But the final maskana is that according to our Mishnah and according to one version in Rabbi Yishmael, you are allowed Hosafos. We have two versions in Rabbi Yishmael, which is somewhat common. Now the Gemara introduces another brisa and tries to analyze which Tana, which Shita in the Tanoim is reflected in this following brisa. B'yontav Ma'achrim, on Yontiv Ma'achrim Lavo Umemarim Batzis, we tend to allow for people to come a little bit late because they're busy on Yontiv even before Tefillah, preparing for the Sudas Yontif, because Meleches Ochel Nefesh is Muteres on Yontif, and even though it's not usually the men who are specifically involved in preparing for the food of Yontif, but nevertheless, they have to help out. If the wives are busy in the kitchen cooking for Yontif, for the Sudas Yontif, they are busy with the children and they're supervising the house. So they also need some time on Yontif morning so that when we come back from shul, and that's called Memayrim Lotzes, we can try to rush home, so to speak, after synagogue. In order to fulfill the mitzvah of Simchas Yontif, we need the Suda. The Suda's already been prepared before they leave the shul. So that's called Ma'achrim Lovo Memayrim Lotzes. But however, in contrast, on Yom Kippurim, there's no Su'udah. There's no Achil and Shasiyah. Is Memayrim Lovo Ma'achrim Lotzes. This we sing in one of these mirrors on Shabbos. We want to get to the shul as early as we can, and we want to leave the latest time that we can. We want to extend that time in the Beis HaKnesses. Halvai, every Jew should feel that he wants to do so. And therefore, on Yom Kippurim, we will come early and leave late. Shabbos, we don't have to bother ourselves before Tefillah with Hachanas Suda because there's no Heter Meleches Ochel Nefesh, and therefore all of the Hachanas, all the preparations for the Suda Shabbos were already achieved on Erev Shabbos. Therefore, Memayrim Lov, we should come early. Memayrim Lotzes, however, in the case of Shabbos, we should try to, in a sense, curtail the davening in shul and come up early so that we can fulfill the mitzvah of owning Shabbos. Now, this brisa says that on Yom Kippur, Ma'achrid Lotzes, we come a little bit late. We leave the shul a little bit late. But on Shabbos, Memayrim Lotzes. Why? Because Yom Kippur has a longer tefillah than Shabbos. Lema, shall we assume, Rabbi Akiva, that this brisa reflects the shita of Rabbi Akiva, the Islay Gavri Yisera. The reason why on Yom Kippur is Ma'achrim Lotzes, and we delay our exit and termination from the shul on Yom Kippur, is because we're busy with another aliyah. Because according to Rabbi Akiva, on Yom Kippur we have 7 aliyahs. So this bothered the mind of the Rashba. How could it be that the Gemara say because Rabbi Akiva added 1 extra aliyah, therefore we can apply the principle of Ma'achrim Lotzes? What do you mean Ma'achrim Lotzes? He asks it beautifully. He says, "B'tosefes man shall kriyas adam echad b'parshas achrimos and nikris b'yom Kippur yesh ikuv gadol kol kach shebeglol yisachru lotzes yosef me'asher b'chol Shabbos shebechalkim b'parsha l'shisha kruim," because he jacked it up on Yom Kippur according to Rabbi Akiva from 6 to 7 kruim. Therefore, Ma'achrim Lotzes. Therefore, there's such an arichas dvarim. I mean, you're basically reading the same parsha of Achrimos, just that you're chopping it up into slightly smaller pieces, 1/7. So why is that called Ma'achrim Lotzes? And he adds a little bit of flame of fire here. He says that on Shabbos usually the Kriya is much longer than that of Yom Kippur. So to say that on Shabbos it's Memayrim Lotzes, and on Yom Kippur it's Ma'achrim Lotzes, that doesn't make any sense, simply because Rabbi Akiva has an extra aliyah, number 7, on Yom Kippur. So the Rashba answers the following. Why does the Gemara say that this brisa is attributable and should be attributed to Rabbi Akiva? It's not because of Ma'achrim Lotzes. That was our assumption based on Rashi. But because the brisa says that Yom Kippurim Achrei Shabbos, the reason why Yom Kippur is mentioned after Shabbos is Lefisha Yom Kippur Mosifim Korei Yosem Asher B'Shabbos. The reason why, in the order and the sequence here, Yom Kippur is mentioned after Shabbos. Again, this is a girsa of the Rashba. We don't even have that girsa. But in the Rashba's text, Yom Kippur was mentioned after Shabbos. And the reason for that is because Yom Kippurim has an extra aliyah, and we always quote the holidays and their respective number of aliyahs in ascending order, going from the lower numbers up to the high numbers. So the fact that in that girsa of the Rashba, Yom Kippurim came last on the list, that's proof positive that it gets 7 aliyahs, where Shabbat came earlier, has only 6 aliyahs. More answers no. I don't have a price problem in attributing the authorship of this price to Rabbi Yishmael. And on Yom Kippur, we have one less karu, namely 6 aliyahs. Then Shabbos that has 7. And nevertheless, you know why it says in the price that feels Yom Kippur Arucha? That it's ma'achrim lotzes. That's for a totally different reason. The nafish sidura the yoma, which means, as the Ran explains it, because we have a long tefillas musaf on Yom Kippur with the Seder Avodas Hayom, and with Marva b'Shvach, and also Bakoshes b'Chila v'Kapara. I would add vidui as well, 10 vidus over the course of Yom Kippur, right? And therefore, we need a day that's dedicated totally to Hashem, exclusively Kulol Hashem. Now, according to the Rashba's Girsa that we had before, that the Gemara knew up front that the reason why we leave the Beis Knesset late on Yom Kippurim is because we say the Seder. But the Gemara's kasha was that the Brisa mentions the number of Kruim of Shabbos, and then afterwards, according to the Girsa of the Rashba, the number of Kruim on Yom. Because Yom Kippurim, there's an extra aliyah. So the Gemara answers no. The reason why we mentioned the din of Yom Kippurim after Shabbos, it's not because we have one extra aliyah. We're now reflecting the sheet of Rabbi Shmuel that Adarabba, Yom Kippurim has one less aliyah, but Rak, Mishum Shomer Bo Seder Avot, because there's going to be a richus with the Seder Avodas Yom Kippurim, that's why it's called Ma'achrim Lotzis. Now the Gemara raises the following question. It's a similar question to what we've seen earlier in terms of the style and the methodology. When we take the Kriyas HaTorah and the number of Kruim on, let's say, a weekday, Monday, Thursday, or Shabbos Mincha for that, and we compare it to Yom Tov, and then we compare that to Shabbos, Hani Shlosha Chamisha V'Shiva Keneged Mi. This sequence of 3 to 5 to 7, what does that correspond to? Now it's interesting. The Gemara back on Daf Chaf Aleph 2 blot ago, right from Sunday, already gave a reason why we call up 3 Kruim on a weekday and on Shabbos Mincha. And there were various shitas, if you remember, Kineged Torah Nevi'im Ksubim, or Kohen Yisrael and Kohen Leviim Yisrael, and so forth and so on. So what is Gemara asking now? Really, what the Gemara is asking, says the Ritva, is can we darshan psukim so that these dinim have an asmachta in a pasuk? And that's what the Gemara is really attempting to achieve. We have to find some sort of an asmachta in the pasuk for these numbers specifically. And if you ask what's the reason why we call it 3 Kruim, it's the Gemara over there on Daf Chaf Aleph. But when we see a sequence of 3, 5, 7, is there anything in the psukim that would give us that sequence of those numbers? Pligi ba Rav Yitzchak bar Nachmani b'chad de'imei umanu Rav Shimon ben Pazi amrilei Rav Shimon ben Pazi b'chad de'imei umanu Rav Yitzchak bar Nachmani v'amrilei. I'll just say Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani v'chad Okay, so different ways of transmitting this machlokas. According to one opinion, Chad Omar Keneged Birchas Kohanim. Interesting. The first pasuk of Birchas Kohanim is Yirech Hashem Yishmech. It's only made up of 3 words. And then we go on to the second pasuk, and the second pasuk says, Yo'er Hashem Panav Elecha V'chuneka. So we end up with 5 words. The third pasuk is Yisah Hashem Panav Elecha V'yasem B'cha Shalom, which is 7 words. So that sequence of 3, 5, 7 is reflected in Birchas Kohanim. The Chad Omar, another opinion about the sequence of 3, 5, and 7 is Keneged Shomrei Asaf. Now, who are these Shomrei Asaf? Saf means Sha'arim. These are the gatekeepers. Now we refer back to the Beis HaMikdash. In the Churban of the first Beis HaMikdash, the Vuzaradan, who was sent as he was the chief butcher, on behalf of Nebuchadnezzar, he burns the Beis HaMikdash and sends the people into Golus. He takes Melech Bavel. The Melech Bavel takes the Kohen Gadol and the Skan Kohen Gadol with him into Golus. Veshlosha Shomrei Hasaf. That's what it says in Malachim Beis in the 25th chapter. Haim Shomrei Beis Hamikdash. So what we call Shomrei Beis Hamikdash is called in Tanakh Shomrei Hasaf. Why are they called Shomrei Hasaf? B'nei she'em shomrim b'sha'ar. Okay, fine. They watch the gates. So why is it called Saf? Umezuzas hashar nikreis b'shem Saf. When you refer to the various frames of the entranceway, one on the right, one on the left, one on top of the mashko, those are called Saf. In any event, there was 3 Shomrei Asaf. Now, Tosfos points out that that's not the real reason why we read 3 Kruim and the significance of the number 3 on a day of Chol or on Mincha Shabbos. He says in Cain, if the Ikar Tam was because of the Shomrei Asaf, Yitzchak Sakin Arba Kruim, Shrei Mulvad Shlosha Shomrei Asaf, who's Kasham Od Saris Echad. If you look at the psukim there in Malachim Beis, you'll see that there was an additional person who was called the Saris, and therefore we should have had the number 4. But the Gemara is darshaning not the Ikar Tam, which the Ikar Tam is connected to Tornavim, Suvim, etc., but rather to give it an asmachta in the psukim. So that's the number 3, Keneged Shomrei Asaf. How do we get to 5? And he says, Chamisha Krum Keneged Chamisha Miroe Pnei HaMelech. So there were those who, from a distance, were able to see the countenance of the king. And Shiva, and the number 7 is Roe Pnei HaMelech. Now, what's the difference between Chamisha Meroe Pnei HaMelech and Shiva Roe Pnei HaMelech? Now, it seems that the 5 are Sorim Chashuvim Yosef. They get even closer to the king. The 7, although the Yoshvim Tomid L'fnei HaMelech, but nevertheless at a distance. Okay, fine. He has another pshat here in the Masechet, based on a Yerushalmi, that the extra 2 are what's called the Sofrei Adayonim. Shekosvim is kolin yonim anidonim l'fnei HaMelech. Right, many different councils and consultations and deliberations take place in the presence of the king, and there were 2 scribes that would commit those or summarize those in writing. So what we might call today a court stenographer or something of that. And that was the extra 2 Sofrei Dayanim that jacks up the number from 5 to 7. That's according to one interpretation of the Yerushalmi. Tani Rabbi Yosef Shlosha Chamisha B'Shiva. This is exactly like one of the 2 shittas that we had above. Shlosha Shomrei Asaf, Chamisha Miroe Pnei HaMelech, and Shiva Roe Pnei HaMelech. So that price of Rabbi Yosef would support the second shitta that we had above about the sequence of 3, 5, and 7. Until now, that you have taught us Masechet Megilla, why is it? This is Abai's question to his Rabbi Yosef. My time a little partial. How come you never told us about this number sequence of 3, 5, and 7? Amalei, Rabbi Yosef said to him in response, I thought you knew about this. I didn't feel there was any compelling need to explain this to you. Do I have a record as such that in the past there were things that you asked questions that I concealed their answers? I always gave you I was always forthcoming with the answers that you need. So don't think that I was trying to cheat you out and deny you this knowledge if you've been learning Masechet Megillah with me and I never taught you this. Amalei Yaakov Mino l'Rav Yehuda. He says that the right girsa is not Mina, but rather Mitzah. Ki im haya min lo hayu maskir shmo Yaakov v'shem Rishonim Yirak. Mina, I think, and you have to ask for this you have to go to learn Talmud in the university, but I think the Minim were the early Christians. Maybe after Paul, before in any event, so they wouldn't have quoted Yaakov a Min. We don't bring statements of Torah transmitted by Minim, and therefore you should change the gear so it says Tosfos to Mitzah, that he came from Mitzah. And this Rabbi Yaakov said to Rabbi Yehuda, Hani Shisha Diyom Kippur Keneged Mi. We have a sequence of 3 during Yom Kippur, 5 and 7. But where does Yom Kippur fit in? Can you tell me the significance of the number 6? Does it correspond to something? Amalei Keneged Shisha Sha'amdu Mimino Shal Ezra. Shisha Mismola. So Ezra read the Torah publicly when there was an aliyah from Bavel, from the Gola to Eretz Yisrael. And we're going to read a pasuk now in the 5th chapter, in the 8th chapter of Nehemiah, that tells us about the reading of the Torah. Apparently, the reading of the Torah by Ezra at the time of the aliyah Shnia, what we call, Second Commonwealth, that was a very important Kriyas HaTorah. There are many dinim in Kriyas HaTorah that we derive from that ritual ceremony that took place when Ezra read the Torah publicly. Shenemar, Vayamod Ezra HaSofer al Migdal Eitz Asher Osu L'Davar. Again, this is a little scary. Reminds us of some tragedies that happened in recent history here in Israel. But in any event, so he stood on a Migdal Eitz, Vayamod etzlo Matisyo v'Shama v'Anoya v'Uri v'Chilkia u'Maaseya al Yamino. So we have six people that were standing on his right, flanking the right, and Smolo. Again, let's count Pedoya, Mishael, Malkiah, v'Chashum, v'Chashbadana, Zechariah, Mishulam. So let's count that up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Why 7? Right. We just said there was 6 on the right and 6 on the left. There's something fishy in. But in any event, before we get into that question, which Gemara is going to address immediately, let's just mention that Ezra Sofer stood on a Migdal Eitz. And Metzudas David, over there in Nehemiah, writes that it was Ke'ein Teva. And what was the purpose of this Teva? So this is very interesting that the halacha that we read from the Torah on top of a Teva, which is so common practice both amongst Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, comes from here, says the Metzudas David. Now, there was a special teva, apparently, that was built in order to read the Torah from. On his right side, there were 6 people. On his left side, how many people on his left side? Hani Shiva, Hani Zechariah and Meshula. So it means that the name of the 6th person in this list of 6 people who flanked Ezra on the left is really Zachariah, but he had a second name, like an acronym, Meshulam. Meshulam. Now, what is the significance of the name Meshulam? I mean, if his name is Zachariah, just leave it as such. But my crow, Meshulam, why is it so compelling for the pasuk to indicate his other name? Meshulam is the Mishalem Be'ovdei. In other words, there was a certain shlemus in the maisim of Zachariah. He was what you'd call a tamim. Tamim means an ideal person, a well-rounded, perfect person. And we add the name Meshulam to his name Zachariah to indicate how great of a righteous person he was. He was a tzaddik amiti, as we would say. This is pretty amazing, that a katan who cannot be motzi anyone because he's not a bar mitzvah, and yet, with regard to Birchas HaTorah and the reading of the Torah, we can call him up for an aliyah, afilu isha. Now, Aisha doesn't bother me so much because a woman can volunteer for any mitzvah. And even if she's not obligated, but she can do it voluntarily. But a katan, he's not chayv in any mitzvahs. So you can't talk about volunteering as if it was a chova when there is no such thing as a chova in the case of a katan. So first of all, we have to point out that the Mechaber in Shulchan Aruch, when he codifies this statement in the Bryce in Arachaim Siman Reish Pei Beis, he points out that we're talking about a katan who's yodea l'mi mevarch. But he knows what a bracha is all about. He understands it's to mahader, meromem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Magen Avram adds the following comment. Eino yachol lotzi acherim b'kriyasa ad sheyagil legil shlosh shana. And once he reaches 13, we assume a chazaka that he has shtei sacks, but he cannot be motzi others yidei chavasam until he becomes a gadol. But yet our Brisa says that a katan is olam in shiva. How could he read and make the bracha on behalf of the tzibur as a karu, as an olah, when he cannot be motzi acher yidei chavas? He doesn't have a chova. Apparently, we have to conclude that kriya doesn't mean that a bar chiyuv is being motzi. Kriya means he's creating a kriya, right? There are words that you have to listen to. It's not like another mitzvah where if, let's say, Reuven wants to be motzi Shimon, there's a ma'aseh mitzvah and Reuven does a ma'aseh mitzvah on behalf of Shimon. No. We're talking here about Kriyas HaTorah. Kriyas HaTorah is not a classic ma'aseh mitzvah, rather it's the creation of Torah. Like, for example, the Rav once told us, this question came up in front of his father, of Moshe, whose yahrzeit is today. I think today's Gimel Shvat. Get that right? When was Rosh Chodesh? Sunday? On Monday. So today is Tuesday. So tonight is the yahrzeit of Rav Moshe. Anyway, Rav Moshe said that one of the people in the tzibur came over to him and asked him, the shliach tzibur told me that who's reading the Torah, he has in mind to exclude him. He doesn't want to be motzi. They were apparently in an altercation. So Moshe said it doesn't matter. It's not up to him. He just reads the Torah, and you're yotzi by hearing the Torah. It's not like another mitzvah where you say Reuven is motzi Shimon. And therefore, a katan can create an entity of Torah. We call it a heftzah shel Torah. And Isha also, she doesn't have a chovas gavra, but she can create an entity of Torah. And once you have an entity of Torah, you make a bracha on the entity of Torah. It's not a bracha on the chovas gavra, but on the heftzah shel Torah. In brisket terminology. A woman should shy away from reading the Sefer Torah publicly because of kavarat tzibur. And the question is whether the Gemara now is completely backtracking, and even b'di'evet, let's say a woman did read the Torah, Are the Chacham establishing that the tzibur is not yotze? It just says Amru Chacham Isha lo tikra b'Torah. But maybe that's only lechatchila. However, halacha l'maisa, the Smag and many others say that Amru Chachamim is she cannot read, period. And even b'di'evid, you're not yotze. They're not yotze. They chovaso and Isha could not be motzi rabim yidei chovas. Iboilu maftir maushi yala leminyan shiva. Shall we say that amongst the 7 kruim that we need on a Shabbos, we could also include the maftir? Or shall we say no? We need 7 kruim besides the maftir. The maftir is an addition to the 7 kruim. He's a tosefes. And on this question, we have machlokes amoron. Rav Huna, Rav Yirmiyah, Bar Abba. Chana Omar, according to one opinion, Ola, we can count the maftir as one of the 7 kruim. Chana Omar, this is more familiar with our minute, Eino Ola. We need 7 kruim and then a maftir in addition to the 7 kruim, but we must have 7 kruim, non-inclusive of the maftir. He writes here that B'Tisha B'Av Chachal B'Mei Sheni V'Chamishi Olim L'Torah Shlosha Kruim V'Echad Maftir. V'Chosva Tosis Shemi Brisa Zu Muchach Kidas HaSovrim Shal Maftir Ola L'Minyan HaKruim Kim Eino Ola Minyanam. Is Hayutzrichim Likro Shlosha Kruim Milvad HaMaftir. Interesting. So he has a sheet of Tosus that the maftir is really the seventh Ola. Because in the case of a maftir that has 3 kruim, if you hold that the maftir is not Ola, then you'll have to have 4 aliyos, which we don't have. For example, in the case of Tisha B'Av on a Monday or a Thursday, should we add an extra maftir? So Tos says no, we can only have 3 kruim, because we paskin that Ola, that he is the 7th aliyah. Mandi Omar Ola to Hakari. He's reading from the Torah. Why shouldn't he be considered one of the aliyos to calculate the minyan akruim? Umadi Omer Eno. Well, that's the sheet that we need to understand. Why is the maftir not included in the kruim? The Omer Ula mipnei ma maftir b'novi tzarch sheyikol b'torah tchila mipnei kavod hatzibur. The keva the mishum kavod haTorah. They covered that Torah, sorry. The cave in the Mishum covered that Torah, Leminyan lo Solk. In other words, the Takanas Chachamim of Maftir bin Novi was to contrast the Kriya of the Torah with the Maftir of Novi. And that's called Kavod Torah. They want to make a heker of Kavod Torah, that Kavod Torah is greater than Kavod Novi. And therefore, ein miyachadim ola sheyikol rak b'novi. Aval hakore b'novi makdim v'kore gam b'torah. So therefore, the Gemara says, "Minyana lo solik ain't only Yeminian shiva." We call 7 aliyos for a chova, and afterwards we add the maftir as an extra kriya, which is not l'shem chova, but rather mishum kavod Torah, in order to contrast the Torah with Nevi'im. So it seems that the Gemara uses the word maftir in a different way than we use the word maftir. we don't use maftir b'navi so much. We think the maftir is like a repetition of the last psukim of the Torah. But the Gemara is talking about maftir b'navi. So they called up all the minyan akrum that were necessary in the Torah itself, and then they called up a maftir b'navi. The Gemara has a question on this sheet in the Amoraim that maftir is not part of the minyan shiva. Maftir b'navi lo yivchos mi-esrim v'echad psukim. We're going to require a minimum of 21 psukim in navi keneged shiva shekaru b'Torah. In other words, each one of the kruim read 3 psukim. And therefore, if we multiply 7 kruim on Shabbos by 3 psukim, we end up with 21 psukim. And we want the navi to be corresponding, like a mirror image of the minimum number of psukim that we would have had to read on Shabbos. And therefore, since the number is 21, we need a minimum of 21 psukim in the navi. V'im Isa, if you're going to tell me that the maftir is not all the minyan shiva, so that means in addition to the 7 krum, we have an 8th karu, and that jacks up the number to 8. And now you multiply 8 by 3 because there are 3 psukim for each of the 8 olim, and you end up with Esrim v'Arba Havin, with 24. Right? Why does it say in the Brisa that we read a minimum of 21 psukim? There should be a requirement of a minimum of 24 psukim, 8 times 3. So where it says Kevon to Mishum Kavod Torah, there's no special chiyuv to add beyond the Kriyas HaTorah, but we only do because of Kavod Torah, is therefore Kenegdo Nami Lopoi.